If it matters, take care of it. That was the sentence everyone in Maplewood knew, even if nobody wanted to hear it. Frank Mercer said it about everything. He said it about fences. He said it about gutters. He said it about garden hoses left in the driveway. He even said it about trees. Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, while most of the neighborhood was still finishing breakfast, Frank walked across his front lawn carrying a small weathered notebook and a sharpened pencil. He would stop beside each tree on his property, look up into its branches, make a note, and quietly call out a name. Captain Oak. Looking good. A few steps later, he would nod toward another tree. Sergeant Maple. Little dry today. Then came Major Pine, Lieutenant Birch, and half a dozen others. The children thought he was crazy. The adults thought he was lonely. Frank didn't care what anyone thought. His lawn was trimmed with military precision. His mailbox stood perfectly straight, and his white sneakers somehow stayed spotless through every season of Ohio weather. The rest of Maplewood lived by ordinary suburban rules. Frank lived by Frank's rules. That was why nobody was surprised when the moving truck arrived across the street, and Frank immediately began watching from behind his curtains. New neighbors meant new problems. At least, that was what he believed. The Bennett family moved in on a warm Saturday morning in late June. Boxes piled up on the driveway. Neighbors stopped by with cookies and introductions. Children rode bicycles in circles around the cul-de-sac. Frank watched all of it from a distance. Then he noticed the boy. Skinny. Messy brown hair. Thick glasses. Endless energy. The kid bounced from one activity to another like he had 3 different thoughts every second. His name, Frank would later learn, was Noah Bennett. And before the day was over, Noah had already discovered the one thing everyone else in Maplewood knew to avoid. Frank's lawn. The accident happened just after dinner. A baseball sailed high into the evening sky, drifted over the street, and landed with a soft bounce near Sergeant Maple. Noah froze. His friends froze. Even the adults unloading. Boxes seemed to stop moving. Frank slowly stepped out of his front door. He looked at the ball. Then he looked at Noah. Without saying a word, he picked it up. The baseball was old and scuffed. One side had been marked with a crooked blue star. Frank turned it over in his hand for a moment. Then he tucked it beneath his arm and walked back inside his house. The door closed. Silence followed. Noah stared across the street in disbelief. Did he just steal my baseball? He asked. Nobody answered. A few neighbors exchanged knowing looks. Mrs. Evelyn Hart, the neighborhood association president, simply sighed and shook her head. Across the street, hidden from view, Frank placed the baseball on a shelf in his workshop. For a brief second, his eyes lingered on the blue star. Then he closed the cabinet door. Outside, Noah planted his hands on his hips and narrowed his eyes toward the house. At that moment, a decision was made. Frank Mercer believed he had just removed a baseball from his lawn. What he had actually done was declare war on the most determined 9-year-old in Maplewood. The following Monday, Maplewood woke up expecting another quiet summer day. Instead, it woke up to a bright blue chalk line running along the edge of Frank Mercer's lawn. The line stretched nearly 20 feet and ended with a large smiling face wearing oversized glasses. Neighbors slowed their morning walks to stare. Children pointed and laughed. Mrs. Evelyn Hart nearly dropped her coffee. Everyone knew exactly who was responsible. Frank stepped outside at 7 o'clock sharp, carrying his notebook. He stopped. He looked down at the chalk. He looked across the street. Noah Bennett sat on his front porch eating a bowl of cereal with the expression of someone who had absolutely nothing to do with the situation. For nearly 10 seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Frank took out a measuring tape from his pocket and carefully measured the distance between the chalk line and his grass. Noah blinked twice. That was not the reaction he expected. Frank wrote something in his notebook, nodded to himself, and continued his tree inspection. Captain Oak. Healthy. He moved to the next tree. Sergeant Maple. Looking strong. Noah lowered his spoon. The old man had ignored the joke. That somehow felt worse. By Wednesday, Noah escalated the conflict. A small battery-powered speaker hidden inside a hedge began producing soft meowing sounds at 5:30 in the morning. The noise drifted through the neighborhood like a lost kitten searching for breakfast. Several residents stepped outside to investigate. Frank emerged carrying a flashlight despite the fact that the sun had already risen. He searched for nearly 20 minutes before locating the speaker. Noah watched from his bedroom window, barely containing his laughter. Frank picked up the device and turned it off. Then he surprised everyone again. The next morning, the speaker reappeared on Noah's porch. It had been polished. The batteries had been replaced. A handwritten note sat beside it. It read, "Poor concealment. Improve camouflage." Noah stared at the message. For the first time, he laughed so hard he nearly dropped his glasses. The strange war continued throughout the summer. Noah placed tiny plastic dinosaurs around Frank's mailbox. Frank arranged them into neat military formations. Noah tied colorful ribbons to the fence. Frank sorted them by color and length. Every prank seemed to return improved, organized, and somehow transformed into a lesson. The neighbors became invested. People began taking evening walks specifically to see what would happen next. Some even started leaving snacks on their porches while discussing the latest chapter of the ongoing feud. Maplewood felt more alive than it had in years. Yet beneath all the jokes, Noah noticed something unusual. Every evening, just before sunset, Frank would sit alone on a wooden bench beneath Sergeant Maple. He never read, never used a phone, never spoke to anyone. He simply sat there watching the street grow quiet. One evening, Noah looked across from his bedroom window and saw the old man holding the baseball with the blue star. Just for a moment. Then Frank placed it back inside his workshop and closed the door. Noah suddenly realized something. Frank had not thrown the ball away. He had kept it. And for reasons Noah could not explain, that discovery mattered more than getting it back. By the middle of August, the unofficial war had become part of daily life in Maplewood. People no longer asked whether something unusual had happened between Frank Mercer and Noah Bennett. They asked what had happened. On Thursday mornings, neighbors compared stories while collecting their mail. On weekends, children rode bicycles past both houses hoping to witness the latest chapter. Even Mrs. Evelyn Hart secretly admitted that the neighborhood felt more connected than it had in years. Yet something subtle was changing beneath the laughter. Noah still enjoyed challenging Frank, but his curiosity had begun replacing his frustration. The baseball remained in the workshop. Frank still refused to return it. But Noah noticed other things now. Every tool in Frank's garage had a designated place. Every tree received attention. Every loose fence board on the street somehow ended up repaired before anyone asked. One afternoon, Noah watched from across the street as Frank helped an elderly neighbor carry grocery bags inside during a summer rainstorm. The next morning, Frank acted as grumpy as ever. It did not make sense. The man everyone described as unfriendly kept quietly helping people whenever nobody was paying attention. A few days later, Noah was riding his bicycle through the neighborhood when he spotted Frank kneeling beside Sergeant Maple. The old man was carefully brushing dirt away from exposed roots with a small hand tool. Noah coasted to a stop near the curb. "You know it is a tree, right?" he called. "Not a patient in a hospital." Frank did not look up. "If it matters, take care of it." Noah rolled his eyes. "You say that about everything." Frank finally stood and adjusted his hat. "That is because most people stop taking care of things when they become inconvenient." Then he returned to work. The answer stayed with Noah longer than he expected. That evening, he asked his father why Frank lived alone. Daniel Bennett paused for a moment before answering. He explained that Frank's wife had passed away years earlier. His son lived across the country. They rarely spoke. Nobody knew the details. Frank never discussed personal matters. Noah listened quietly. For the first time, the bench beneath Sergeant Maple looked different in his memory. It no longer seemed like the favorite seat of a stubborn old man. It looked like the place where someone sat when there was nobody waiting for them inside the house. A week later, the hottest day of the summer arrived. Temperatures climbed above 90 degrees. Most residents stayed indoors with air conditioning. Around sunset, Noah noticed movement across the street. Frank was carrying several buckets of water from his garage. One by one, he watered every tree. Captain Oak, Sergeant Maple, Major Pine. The routine took nearly an hour. By the time he finished, he looked exhausted. Yet before going inside, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the baseball with the blue star. He turned it over slowly in his hands. Then he sat beneath Sergeant Maple and watched the fading sunlight. Noah remained hidden behind his bedroom curtain, watching from across the street. He still could not explain why the sight affected him. The baseball was just an old ball. Frank was just a difficult neighbor. Yet for the first time since moving to Maplewood, Noah wondered whether the old man was protecting something far more important than a lawn. The first invitation arrived by accident, or at least that was how Frank Mercer pretended it happened. A powerful thunderstorm rolled through Maplewood late one Saturday afternoon, sending residents scrambling indoors. Lawn chairs tipped over. Flower pots rolled across driveways. Tree branches swayed under heavy wind. Noah Bennett stood at his bedroom window watching sheets of rain sweep across the street when he noticed something unusual. The side door of Frank's workshop had blown open. A few minutes later, he spotted Frank struggling to secure it while carrying an armful of tools. Without thinking, Noah ran across the street through the rain. By the time he reached the workshop, both of them were soaked. Together, they managed to close the door before another gust pushed it open again. Frank looked annoyed, mostly because he had been helped. "You tracked mud onto my floor," he said. Noah glanced down. "You are welcome." Frank stared at him for several seconds before letting out a quiet sigh. "Fine. Since you are already here, do not touch anything." Noah stepped inside and immediately forgot about the storm. The workshop was unlike anything he had ever seen. Shelves lined every wall. Hundreds of tools hung in perfect rows. Drawers were labeled with careful handwriting. Old clocks waited to be repaired. Wooden birdhouses sat beside model airplanes. Small projects occupied nearly every available surface. It looked less like a garage and more like a museum built by someone who never stopped working with his hands. Noah slowly turned in a circle. "You built all this." Frank adjusted a wrench on a nearby workbench. "Most of it." Noah noticed a framed photograph sitting beside a lamp. A smiling woman stood next to a younger version of Frank. The expression on his face was different in the picture. Lighter somehow. Noah recognized her immediately. Frank's wife. The one his father had mentioned. He did not ask questions. Something told him not to. Instead, he wandered toward a shelf filled with unusual objects. A bird feeder shaped like a lighthouse. A mailbox decorated with carved stars. A small wooden train. Every item seemed connected to a story. "Who made this one?" Noah asked, pointing toward the train. Frank paused. "My wife painted it." The answer came quietly. Noah nodded. A few moments later, Frank handed him a screwdriver. "Hold this." Then another tool. Then a flashlight. Before long, they were repairing a broken weather vane together. Neither of them mentioned how strange the situation was. The rain continued tapping against the roof while the workshop filled with the sounds of simple work. For the first time, Noah saw Frank smile. It lasted less than a second and disappeared almost immediately, but it was there. As evening approached, the storm finally weakened. Noah prepared to leave when something caught his eye. Resting inside a cabinet with its doors slightly open sat the baseball with the blue star. Carefully cleaned, carefully preserved. Frank noticed where he was looking. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Frank closed the cabinet door and reached for his notebook. "If it matters, take care of it," he said. Noah looked at the cabinet, then at the old man standing beside it. This time the sentence felt different. Much bigger than a baseball. Summer settled comfortably over Maplewood after the storm, and without anyone officially planning it, a new routine emerged. Nearly every afternoon, Noah Bennett crossed the street and disappeared into Frank Mercer's workshop. Neither of them ever called it a friendship. Frank would have rejected the word immediately. Noah would have laughed and denied it. Yet day after day, they found themselves working side by side. Some afternoons, they repaired birdhouses for neighbors. Other days, they restored old garden tools that people had forgotten in garages. Once they spent 3 hours fixing a mailbox that Mrs. Evelyn Hart insisted had sentimental value because it had survived 4 different homeowners. The mailbox was worth maybe $20. Frank treated it like a priceless artifact. "If it matters, take care of it," he said while carefully sanding the wood. Noah rolled his eyes, but he found himself repeating the sentence later that evening when helping his mother water flowers. The entire neighborhood slowly became part of their strange partnership. Children began bringing broken toys to the workshop. Adults stopped by asking for advice about loose fence posts or squeaky gates. Frank never admitted he enjoyed the visits, but Noah noticed he started keeping extra folding chairs available. One Saturday morning, a little girl named Lily arrived carrying a stuffed rabbit with a torn ear. She looked heartbroken. Frank examined the rabbit with the seriousness of a surgeon studying an important case. 30 minutes later, the rabbit left with a neatly repaired ear and an official certificate declaring it fit for active duty. Lily smiled so widely that even Frank seemed unable to hide a small grin. Noah saw it. Mrs. Evelyn saw it. Half the neighborhood probably saw it. Nobody mentioned it. Some moments were better left alone. The workshop gradually transformed into something larger than a workspace. It became a gathering place. Stories were exchanged there. Advice was offered there. Laughter seemed to linger there long after people went home. Yet the most memorable moments were often the smallest ones. Frank teaching Noah how to sharpen a pencil with a pocket knife. Noah secretly replacing the batteries in Frank's flashlight before they ran out. Frank pretending not to notice. Noah bringing lemonade on hot afternoons. Frank pretending he did not like it while drinking every drop. Those simple rituals became the real heart of the summer. One evening near the end of August, Noah arrived to find Frank standing beneath Sergeant Maple, studying the branches overhead. A small wooden birdhouse hung from one limb. Together they watched a family of bluebirds fly in and out of the opening. Neither spoke for several minutes. They simply stood there listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening. Across the street, sprinklers clicked rhythmically across lawns. Somewhere a radio played softly. Children laughed in the distance. It felt peaceful. It felt permanent. Noah glanced at Frank and noticed something unusual. The old man looked content. Not happy exactly. Frank Mercer was probably incapable of looking openly happy. But he looked comfortable, as if the loneliness that had followed him for years had stepped back just far enough for him to breathe. Neither of them realized how much they had begun to depend on these ordinary days. Neither of them realized that before long, the future would quietly place everything they had built into question. September arrived quietly, carrying cooler mornings and the first hints of autumn across Maplewood. The leaves on Captain Oak had begun turning gold around the edges, and Frank Mercer seemed unusually interested in inspecting every tree twice a day. Noah Bennett noticed it immediately. Something felt different. Not wrong exactly, just distant. The change began on a Tuesday afternoon. Noah crossed the street as usual and found the workshop door closed. That had never happened before. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Finally, the door opened a few inches. Frank stood there holding a toolbox. "Busy today," he said. "Come back tomorrow." The door closed before Noah could respond. The same thing happened the next day, and the day after that. Soon entire afternoons passed without their usual projects. The folding chairs remained empty. The birdhouse repairs stopped. Even the evening conversations beneath Sergeant Maple disappeared. Noah could not understand it. He replayed every recent interaction in his mind, searching for something he had done wrong. Had he broken a tool? Said something offensive? Forgotten an important task? Nothing made sense. Meanwhile, Frank seemed determined to create distance. Whenever Noah waved, Frank offered a brief nod and continued walking. Whenever neighbors gathered near the workshop, Frank found reasons to stay inside. Maplewood noticed. Mrs. Evelyn Hart asked whether the two of them had argued. Noah shrugged and claimed everything was fine. It was easier than admitting he felt hurt. One Saturday morning, Noah was helping his parents unload groceries when he overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. Daniel Bennett and Rachel Bennett stood near the driveway, discussing an opportunity. A prestigious science academy several states away had accepted Noah into an advanced student program beginning the following summer. It was an incredible opportunity, one that could eventually lead to scholarships, internships, and a future Noah had only dreamed about. His parents sounded excited, proud, hopeful. Noah should have felt the same way. Instead, his eyes drifted across the street toward Frank's house. Unseen by anyone, Frank had been working near the side fence. He had heard every word. That evening he sat beneath Sergeant Maple longer than usual. The baseball with the blue star rested beside him on the bench. He turned it slowly between his hands as the sun disappeared. Years earlier, after losing his wife and slowly drifting apart from his son, Frank had made a decision. Never become attached. Never depend on anyone. Never risk that kind of emptiness again. Somehow, without noticing, he had broken every one of those rules. Noah had become part of his daily life. Part of the workshop. Part of the neighborhood he loved. And now the future was quietly preparing to take that away. The next week, Frank became even more distant. Noah felt every inch of the growing space between them. The workshop no longer felt welcoming. The street no longer felt the same. For the first time since arriving in Maplewood, Noah found himself avoiding the front window because looking across at the house hurt more than he wanted to admit. Neither of them spoke about what was happening. Neither of them understood that they were standing in the same pain from opposite sides. One feared he was no longer wanted. The other feared losing someone who mattered. October arrived with cool mornings, bright leaves, and a silence that seemed to settle between the houses on both sides of the street. The distance between Frank Mercer and Noah Bennett had become impossible to ignore. They still saw each other almost every day, but the easy rhythm that had once connected them was gone. The workshop lights still turned on each afternoon. The trees still received their inspections. The neighborhood still moved forward. Yet something important felt missing. One Friday evening, Noah wandered through Maplewood without any particular destination. As he passed Mrs. Evelyn Hart's house, she called him over and handed him a small wooden birdhouse. Noah recognized it immediately. He and Frank had repaired it together during the summer. "The bluebirds came back," she said with a smile. "I thought you should know." Noah thanked her and continued walking. For a moment, he remembered the laughter, the projects, and the afternoons that had once seemed endless. Across town, Frank sat alone in his workshop staring at a workbench covered with unfinished repairs. For weeks, he had convinced himself that distance was the right choice. Noah would leave eventually. The science program would lead to bigger opportunities. Better opportunities. Frank told himself he was helping by stepping back early. But every day felt a little quieter than the one before. The workshop no longer sounded the same. The neighborhood no longer felt the same. Even Captain Oak and Sergeant Maple seemed lonely standing in the autumn sunlight. Late the next afternoon, Noah finally crossed the street. He did not knock. He simply walked toward the workshop and found the door unlocked. Inside, Frank was repairing an old clock. Neither spoke at first. The ticking filled the room. Finally, Noah glanced around and noticed something unusual. The baseball cabinet stood slightly open. For the first time, the Blue Star baseball was sitting on the workbench instead of hidden away. Noah looked at it, then at Frank. "Why did you keep it?" he asked quietly. Frank continued adjusting the clock mechanism. Several seconds passed before he answered. "Because it mattered." Noah waited. Frank set down the screwdriver and carefully picked up the baseball. The leather showed signs of age now. Small repairs had been made over the years. The Blue Star remained visible. "You thought I kept a baseball," Frank said. "What I kept was the day everything changed." Noah felt his throat tighten. Frank turned the ball over in his hands. "The workshop was quiet before you showed up. The neighborhood was quieter too." That was all he said. No speech. No dramatic confession. Just a simple truth. Noah looked around the room. Suddenly, he noticed evidence of their summer everywhere. The repaired birdhouses. The mailbox. The model airplane. The flashlight. Memories sat on every shelf. "If it matters, take care of it," Noah said softly. For the first time in weeks, Frank looked directly at him. Then he nodded once. It was a small gesture, almost invisible. Yet in that moment, both of them understood something important. Neither had been protecting themselves from loss. They had been protecting themselves from caring. And caring had already happened. After that afternoon, the distance between Frank Mercer and Noah Bennett began to disappear, not through grand conversations, but through ordinary days returning to life. The workshop became busy again. The folding chairs came back outside. The unfinished projects slowly disappeared from the workbench one by one. Autumn settled over Maplewood, painting the neighborhood in shades of gold and red. On cool Saturday mornings, Frank and Noah walked through the neighborhood carrying tools, helping residents prepare for winter. They repaired loose shutters, cleaned gutters, adjusted fence gates, and secured decorations. Before the first frost arrived, nobody officially asked them to do these things anymore. Somehow it had simply become what they did. The entire community seemed connected by those routines. Mrs. Evelyn Hart started bringing fresh muffins whenever they worked near her house. Lily often stopped by with updates about the rabbit, whose repaired ear still looked perfect. Children rode bicycles past the workshop after school just to see what project might be underway. Maplewood no longer felt like a collection of houses. It felt like a neighborhood again. One afternoon, Noah arrived carrying a large envelope. He found Frank trimming branches near Sergeant Maple. "The academy sent more information," Noah said. Frank nodded without looking up. "Good. They want me there by next summer." Frank clipped another branch. "Sounds like they know what they are doing." Noah waited for something more. Nothing came. Yet this time the silence felt different. Frank was no longer pushing him away. He was simply trying to do something much harder. He was trying to support a future that would eventually take Noah elsewhere. Weeks passed. The first cold mornings arrived. One evening they sat beneath Sergeant Maple watching leaves drift across the lawn. Noah noticed Frank studying the baseball again. The Blue Star had faded slightly over the years, but it remained visible. "You should keep it," Noah said. Frank shook his head. "Not yet." Noah smiled. "You are still stubborn. Experience has taught me that stubbornness is underrated." Noah laughed. Some things never changed. And that was comforting. As October gave way to November, preparations for Noah's future became more real. College brochures arrived. Program schedules arrived. Family discussions became frequent. Every step forward felt exciting. Every step forward also reminded both of them that time was moving faster than either wanted to admit. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing shelves in the workshop, Noah found an old photograph tucked behind a toolbox. It showed Frank standing beside his wife many years earlier. Both were smiling. On the back, written in faded ink, was a short note. "The good memories stay." Noah stared at the words for several seconds before carefully returning the photograph to its place. That evening, he noticed Frank watching the sunset beneath Sergeant Maple again. The old man looked thoughtful but peaceful. For the first time, Noah understood that healing was not about avoiding loss. It was about choosing to keep the good memories anyway. And as the final leaves drifted from the branches overhead, both of them quietly prepared for the challenge neither could stop from coming. Winter eventually gave way to spring, and before anyone was ready, the day arrived. The Bennett family's driveway was crowded with boxes. A rented trailer sat attached to the back of Daniel Bennett's truck. Neighbors stopped by throughout the morning bringing cookies, cards, and last-minute advice. Maplewood felt unusually quiet beneath all the activity. Noah Bennett moved back and forth carrying boxes, but every few minutes his eyes drifted across the street. Frank Mercer's house looked exactly the same as it always had. The lawn was perfect. The trees stood proudly in the morning sunlight. Captain Oak and Sergeant Maple had survived another winter. Yet one thing was different. Frank was nowhere to be seen. By noon, most of the truck had been loaded. Mrs. Evelyn Hart hugged Noah and wished him luck. Lily handed him a small drawing of a rabbit. Neighbors waved from porches and sidewalks. Still no sign of Frank. Noah told himself it did not matter. He told himself the old man hated goodbyes. He told himself that some people simply were not built for emotional moments. But the empty feeling remained. Finally, with only a few boxes left, Noah crossed the street one last time. The workshop door was open. Inside, Frank stood at the workbench adjusting a small hinge on a wooden box. He looked up briefly. "You were supposed to be packing." Noah smiled. "I am packed." Frank nodded. Silence filled the room. The familiar shelves. The familiar tools. The familiar smell of sawdust and machine oil. Every corner held memories. For a moment, neither knew what to say. Then Frank reached beneath the workbench and picked up something wrapped in a clean cloth. He held it out. Noah carefully unfolded the fabric. Inside rested the baseball with the blue star. Time seemed to stop. The leather showed years of careful repairs. The faded stitching remained intact. Every mark was still there. Noah stared at it without speaking. "You fixed it," he finally whispered. Frank shrugged. "Needed maintenance." Noah laughed despite the lump forming in his throat. Some things never changed. Frank placed his hands in his pockets. "If it matters, take care of it." The sentence sounded different now than it had the first time. Noah understood that it had never been about lawns or fences or tools. It had always been about people. Slowly, Noah closed his fingers around the baseball. Then he stood straight and raised his hand in a crisp salute. Frank looked surprised for exactly half a second. Then he returned the salute. No speeches, no dramatic promises, just a simple gesture between two people who understood each other. A few minutes later, the truck pulled away from the curb. Neighbors waved as it disappeared down the street. Frank remained standing beneath Captain Oak long after everyone else had gone home. Eventually, he opened his weathered notebook and turned to the page where he recorded his daily inspections. He read through the familiar names one by one. Captain Oak, Sergeant Maple, Major Pine. Then he took out his pencil and added a new entry at the bottom of the list. Private Noah. He closed the notebook, looked across at the empty house, and smiled quietly as a warm spring breeze carried a few leaves across the lawn.